I would like to introduce Randy DeShazo, who is Deputy Director of the South Florida Regional Planning Council, and they have put together a presentation that I think, I know it's very interesting for me. I took a lot of it out of it, and I think I might have to carry it around in my pocket here for the next few months as we have different discussions. But this is outlining the economic impact of Tri-Rail on Southeast Florida. So, Randy, thank you very much for joining us.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair Regalado, board members. Thank you for having me today. What I'm going to be doing is talking about the economic impact of Tri-Rail across the region and also how those impacts spill across Florida. All right, so I'm sorry, Chair Woodward, I apologize. I missed a cue there. Please accept my apologies. In any case, the economic impact of Tri-Rail spread across many different dimensions, operations and maintenance, traveler and labor access, and then property value impacts. It also helps to generate new opportunities, and I'll talk about all of those today. But when we do talk about economic impacts, we do talk about them in a few limited terms. One is how many jobs are created, what's the personal income, we'll talk a bit about that. Gross regional product is another way of thinking about the size of the economy. It's analogous to the domestic economy of the U.S., so GDP, but only for South Florida, Southeast Florida. And a really key point that I want to mention is that O&M is not just a cost, a budget line cost. It is also an investment. And why that is important is that about 64% of all of the dollars spent on O&M on this system actually stay in the region, generating new jobs and new investment, and over again, cycling to the economy. All right, nothing here that you wouldn't know in terms of background other than to emphasize that Tri-Rail has an outsized influence on some sectors of the economy. I'll specifically call out the airports. And then I'm going to move into some of the details of our study. First, in terms of what is a direct impact and then what is an indirect economic impact. Direct impact are things that are derived from the expenditures of the Tri-Rail system. So your wage bill, your purchase of fuel, the right-of-way maintenance costs. All of those things are direct economic impacts, and then they start spreading through the economy. At a certain point, you're going to need, say, legal assistance or some other professional services like engineers. Those are indirect impacts. And what they do is that they fall into certain categories. O&M, as I mentioned before, but also traveler mobility. What do you actually gain from this investment in terms of improved performance on the transportation system? That's also clearly a very important part of this. And then there's something very special and specific about what passenger rail can do, which is that it helps expand labor access, people's ability to obtain higher paying jobs, and we'll talk a bit about how we monetize all of those benefits. And then there are some other important things on the indirect side. So indirectly, the Tri-Rail stations generate increased property value and therefore tax revenue, and it induces development to continue that path and guarantee future development. And then there are environmental impacts, which are a bit harder to monetize, but are necessarily part of the picture that we're looking at today. All right, there's a lot of text here, so I'll just kind of like try to get to the fun parts of it. We worked with Kimley-Horn in producing model outputs from SERPM to help understand what are the changes that Tri-Rail induces in the overall transportation network, to look at how Tri-Rail contributes to reducing congestion, and then how those reductions in congestion in turn put money in people's pockets, not just for Tri-Rail riders, but also for the general public who are benefiting, especially on the I-95 corridor and parallel arterials, from the investment in Tri-Rail. So there are ways to monetize those impacts. Then we'll talk a bit more about some of these other things. Again, I don't want to belabor all the stuff on this slide. So I'm going to get right to the big numbers here. Basically, what you'll see in the two bars there in front of you are the impacts on the Tri-Rail system on gross regional product, and this is on an annual basis, and then on personal income. Now, what you'll see here is it's about $300 million in gross regional product. That means this is the additional value that is generated by investment and jobs because of Tri-Rail. So it's a quite significant gain in gross regional product. It's less than 1% of the overall region's economy, but it's still a significant part of that economy. One thing that I need to point out, though, is that the great majority of that impact just comes from the operations and maintenance piece of what Tri-Rail does. There is a smaller segment which comes from the traveler and labor access benefits. Then we get to personal income. What's important here to recognize is that personal income encompasses a lot of different activities. It's not just wages and salaries, but it's also interest income, it's transfers, it's rental income. It's all kinds of things that are induced one way or another because of this avalanche, if you will, of investment that comes from or derives from Tri-Rail. One way, again, of thinking about this a little bit more is that once you pull out all of those other things that I mentioned, and just focus on the wages part of this, is that you have about an average wage of about $66,000 and $25 over a 20-year period. So it's a fairly stable and competitive wage, we'll call it, in our region. So I'll go ahead and move on to the next one. And then in terms of traveler mobility impacts, there are many different ways of thinking about how do we break up what traveler mobility impacts actually mean. Labor access, that's the ability to access more jobs based on where you live and where you're going. So, for example, if you live in a station area, and that's clearly one direction that we have to go in, is that you might have within a mile of your home, let's say 20 jobs without a rail station. But with that connectivity with Tri-Rail, you might have better access to 50 jobs or 100 jobs. And what that allows is what's called job matching. So it's not necessarily new jobs, but it's your opportunity to get higher paying jobs, to find jobs that better match your skills and your growth potential. So this is one of the things that we consider as calculating what the impact of Tri-Rail is. Then there's personal time. How do you value your personal time that is otherwise lost in congestion? Safety costs, that's more material and easily measured in terms of like avoided crashes. And then same for operating costs, and then some of these others that are perhaps part of the picture but are not as big of a part of the picture as you might expect. All right. So this is my personal favorite part of the study, which is that one of the questions that we wanted to ask is how much does Tri-Rail induce, or does it induce, additional development within their areas, station areas? And it's a key question because clearly a lot of the future of Tri-Rail will be tied up in how do we develop TOD in these areas. Now, we looked at all Tri-Rail stations, and what we did is we looked at the pattern of development prior to and after the opening of a Tri-Rail stop in each one of these locations and compared it to the background rate of growth. And what you'll see on the charts on the right-hand side, I kind of went a little bit wild in terms of the time frame. But Miami down at the bottom, we saw quite a big spike of construction up until about 1929. Something happened, I don't know what, but clearly dropped after that. And a different pattern you see in Pompano Beach. And so in that case, there are spikes. And what you'll see here between Fort Lauderdale, Pompano Beach, and Miami Central is that After the station opened, there was a very significant jump in the number of parcels that were developed in each year. There were smaller effects in West Palm Beach and in Hollywood, and then for the rest of the stations, it was about the same as the surrounding area, so it didn't have a major impact on an individual basis. So this is the first part of it, is like, well, does it induce development? Because it helps us think about, well, what about the future? What is the potential for, how do we anticipate the growth of property values in the future? So we looked at two different radii around the station areas, a half mile and a mile. And we used a technique called hedonic analysis to look at how things like increases in the number of bedrooms or whether or not you have a swimming pool, individually, how much those things might affect the value of your property. And proximity to a rail stop is also one of those amenities. And if you parse all those things out, if you pull all the pieces out and you just leave the distance to a train station, then you get a sense of how much that proximity provides value to your home or other commercial uses or whatever the property use is. Within a half mile, it's about $417 million. That's the increment in value across all of those properties, and about $1.3 billion once you go about a mile out. Now again, this is one way of thinking about it. If you want to talk about it in terms of an annualized benefit, it's closer to $40 to $60 million a year that is generated by these stations. So that's rather by the properties around those stations. All right. So I'm getting to the end of the presentation and then happy to take some questions. Just to kind of reiterate what I've talked about before, once you look at some of the impacts from personal income across operations maintenance and the traveler and labor access benefits, they're fairly significant. Same for gross regional product, and then what I mentioned about property value premiums, which is about $1.6 billion in additional value once you get to 2045. And so the dollar term is $20-25, but it's about $1.6 in additional value once you get out to 2045. All right, so key takeaways for me, a big indicator of why all of this is important is how much property value really influences the future economic potential of the Tri-Rail system, and that it does, in many places, induce development. But what you might expect from, say, systems that are in similarly sized metro areas, say Philadelphia and SEPTA, is that what they see is higher percentage, higher gains or higher premiums on their surrounding properties because of proximity. That's because those areas have got more activities. There's more living and working and playing opportunities around those station areas, so it's a matter of increasing returns. You will see higher gains on property, and you will also see greater use of the system itself. And for that, I would probably say that that is just about it, other than mentioning some of the other things about corridor relief that I already talked about. So I would take questions.
Okay. Mr. Kakachi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. DeShazo, am I saying your name right?
Correct.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. Could we go back to the slide that talks about the $500,000 versus 1.3 there? Oh.
This one?
Yeah, that one. This might be obvious to everyone, but I'm missing it. Why does the value go up as you get further away?
So, yes, it
includes that area.
Yeah, it includes more properties are included within that 1 or so miles.
Okay.
And then what will happen is that the premium, if you look at it as like a sloping line, it goes pretty high up as you're fairly close, not on top of a station, but if you're fairly close, it's very high, and then it starts to slope down, disappearing to about zero as you're about a mile away.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Thank you.
Mr. Vaughn?
Thank you, Mr. DeShazo. I'm wondering if we have enough data to answer the question I'm gonna ask, but I'm gonna take a stab at it. When you look at the slide before this one, you gave a description of property values and enhancement to property values post-development of the station.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if we have enough data to start to talk about or start to make comparisons. If we go back to the slide that had Fort Lauderdale, Pompano, Miami, West Palm, and Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have enough data to start making the argument that even as we are hoping to see improved property values in the more recently developed sites, just based upon what we have now,
Mm-hmm.
we can start making the argument that, look, because Hollywood doesn't have this, or this, which is present at Fort Lauderdale or present at Pompano, we're not seeing the enhanced property values here.
Right.
So even with this minimal change, we can expect, and then it grows exponentially. Do we have enough data to make that argument, or are you still hoping for more?
I don't know if we do have enough data for it, but I believe there have been other studies that have looked at that in other parts of the country. So, you know, to a certain extent, you can always look at those other case studies and say, here are some important indicators. And it may be as time goes by, we get more data, and then we can understand and tweak our understanding a little bit better.
You probably will be the person to point us in the right direction, because obviously not every site is amenable to the same type of development. As much as we would love to take like a cookie cutter,
Right.
Plan and plop it down everywhere if it works, we're limited by a number of different factors. Agreed?
Yes.
So is there a way to cull out pieces of the data
Mm-hmm.
to talk to us about that? I want to figure out how we can inform potential development in sites like Hollywood that have built-in restrictions, whether it be size, other things are on. But how can we pull data from what we have to say, all you need to do is drop a target right here and voila, with something?
Right. I think that there are always ways to proceed along those lines, but often there are very local circumstances, whether or not it is the road network or how much space there is that is actually available for development. So these things are possible to do. I couldn't give you a research design off the top of my head about how to actually do it, but I'm confident that there are ways to approach that problem.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Valachi?
Just a comment. I think it's great that we're making other people wealthy, but I wish there was a way that we could monetize that for ourselves somehow.
Yeah. So at PTAC, somebody raised a similar kind of note on this issue, is that one of the things that we want to make sure we can do is provide affordable housing. And if property values are rising, then perhaps you might face an issue of gentrification or things like that. So one way of thinking about it is that there usually is not much affordable housing that is being built when property values are falling. But when they're rising, then you might have the opportunity to make the argument that, well, there are greater returns, and because there's always a cross-subsidy with market rental to support affordable housing, then the rising, it's a case where a rising tide lifts ships. Maybe not all of them, but some of them.
Thank you. Well, there's no other trains up, but I actually did have a question. If you could go back to the slide on the with the proximity, the property values in the proximity.
This one?
Yes.
Okay.
So a couple, and if I'm looking at this right, which I'm a little shy on coffee this morning, but Miami-Dade seems to be the outlier between Broward and Palm Beach when it comes to property values.
Yes.
Can you explain?
Yes. I think that what you'll see here is, an overall higher background level of property values in that area, and that, you know, I believe there are fewer stations or less developed areas around some of the other, you know, counties and where the Tri-Rail stops are.
Well, that was part of what I was hoping to be able, for more information. I don't know if you'll have it, but, I mean, are these properties, are we looking at it's a higher density versus the actual value of the individual parcels? Are there more, is it residential versus commercial? Like, what is it?
It's usually residential. We're looking at it from a parcel basis because the data are being drawn from the appraisers. And so there are
these numbers that you're giving us are on residential pricing, not overall property values surrounding the station.
Right. It's much easier to obtain that for residential properties.
Okay. Do you know, because I know for Palm Beach County, and I think for a number of stations in Broward as well, there's not a lot of residential necessarily within that half-mile radius. Would that explain some of the discrepancy
It
here
would.
because there's more residential
It
closer
would.
to the station in Miami?
So, in a lot of cases, some kinds of commercial are unaffected by proximity to a rail stop. Surprisingly, in a lot of cases, it's office properties that are not affected by proximity, and so we're finding that in another study right now, that it's really single-family and multifamily, but also not condos. If you're in a condo, it can actually be a disadvantage being close to a train stop.
Okay, well, will you be looking, or will you get that information when it comes to commercial? Because I know a part of how we try to balance any of this when we have our commuters is, you know, they live in one place and work in another.
Yes.
So some of the stations are going to have more of the working component closer to the station versus the residential. And, you know, I think it would be helpful to know, because we are also working to develop the workforce as well and make sure that when people get at that station, you know, if they're leaving their home in Miami-Dade, so they live
Right.
close to that station, but they work somewhere else, then the property values are, I don't know if we want to calculate it based on property value, but is there a way to kind of, you know, give us a number on the economic impact when it comes to the jobs that
Yeah.
might be closer to another station? You don't live there, but you work
Right.
there.
Right.
Are you able to do that?
I will have to think about it.
Okay. Because I do know, I think that there's a number of our stations that are the work side versus the residential side. And we don't need to solely focus on the residential, because
Right.
people are getting on these trains to go to something else. And what
Correct.
is the other thing that they're going to? And if they're not going to someone else's house, they're going to a job.
Right.
Almost half of our stations would be residential and half economic.
True. You do need a mix, and sometimes that mix doesn't necessarily show up in the statistical analysis, because things kind of get washed out sometimes.
Well, I think for this board, or at least for myself, it would be helpful to have some of that, because I know that we've had discussions on encouraging employers to have their workers take the train to their job. And if
Right.
we can kind of prove an economic impact for them to locate their office headquarters or whatever it is, you know, that they do close to one of our train stations, maybe they can pay their workers a little better because they could subsidize them with the trip, and their quality of life is better because they arrive in a happy mood instead of grumpy from sitting on I-95, you know. So I think it would be helpful, because I know we do talk to employers about, hey, put your people on a train.
Right.
And if we can point locations if we can sort of, not that we have to dictate what happens around a train, but if we can identify train stations where people live, but then now we start developing more of that workforce train stations.
Right.
I
think I understand. I will.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Secretary Braun?
Thank you. So, Madam Chair, you piqued my interest with the anomaly here. I think you said it, and I think similarly, I don't necessarily expect the answer here, but on another slide you mentioned Miami Central Station. So I'm assuming the
That's a
anomaly
big part
there
of that.
could be driven by the Miami Central.
Yeah, a lot
So
of
you
it
may
is.
have said it. So it'd be interesting to just see this chart maybe without that station included.
Good.
I mean, just for reference, but anyway, very insightful presentation. So
Thank you.